He was a young law clerk, only 19 years old, and he'd been given a simple task that day in St. Petersburg. He was to carry an important government document from one office building to another and deliver it, signed and sealed, to a prominent official. But as the young man strolled through the busy streets of Russia's capital, he became distracted. There was the beginning of a song floating through his mind. It was just a few notes at first, but those notes led to other notes. And before he knew it, it was a very pretty little melody that was emerging. It wasn't exactly right yet, but if he worked on it just a little... Peter Tchaikovsky always had songs in his head. They'd pop up anywhere and any place, no matter what he was doing or thinking about. He'd find himself humming as he was dressing or eating lunch. While other people talked to him, he would have to filter their words through a melody playing in the back of his mind. Most of all, the songs came to him when he walked. Anything would trigger it, the voices of children at play, the ringing church bells, the birds twittering in the trees, the river splashing over rocks. When there was a song in his head, Peter found it difficult to concentrate. His music always made him nervous and agitated. Now as he tried to work out his latest tune, he began to chew absent-mindedly on the paper he was carrying. He thought, and he chewed and chewed. Finally, as he neared the office, he realized what he'd done. In his hands was the mangled, soggy remnant of an official legal document. Quickly, Peter copied the document from memory. No one knows what he did about the official signature and seal, but somehow he managed to cover his mistake. Still, it was clear even then, Peter Tchaikovsky was not cut out to be a lawyer. The songs that danced in Tchaikovsky's head and made it impossible for him to find rest or concentration would someday all be put on paper. They would inspire and delight music lovers, dancers, children, and other composers throughout the world. Tchaikovsky was the greatest Russian composer of all time, and a man who helped popularize classical music among the masses. His works like the Nutcracker Suite, Swan Lake, and Sleeping Beauty contain some of the most recognizable and the most frequently performed music of all time. It was music with such vast appeal that Walt Disney selected it as the background for his famous animated feature Fantasia. Tchaikovsky's music appeals equally to the sophisticated connoisseur and the fanciful child. As a child, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky was rather fanciful himself. He used to sit in front of the window pane and tap out little songs on the glass as he watched the rain falling outside. These songs used to possess him, even when he was very young. He would get agitated and nervous, trying to give them birth. Once he tapped the window so hard as a child that he broke the glass and cut his fingers. Tchaikovsky was born on May 7, 1840, in the town of Kamsko-Vodkinsk, near the Ural Mountains of Russia. His father worked for the Russian government as an inspector of mines, and his mother was a refined and cultured Frenchwoman. She sang him folk songs and popular arias from operas. Tchaikovsky adored his mother and could never bear to be separated from her. He would have a series of intense relationships with women throughout his life, most of which caused him deep suffering and sadness. Peter's boyhood home was a busy, noisy place, crowded with several brothers, a sister, some cousins, and other miscellaneous relatives. When he was 4 years old, he started taking piano lessons from the French governess who'd been hired to keep this large, bubbling group of children entertained. He also composed his first little ditty, and it's no surprise that the inspiration for it was his mother. The song was entitled Mamas in Petersburg. When Peter's father saw how enthusiastically he took to the piano, he hired a regular piano teacher for him. Mrs. Tchaikovsky wasn't sure about all this. Peter was already an overly excited child, and she saw that music made him so excited he couldn't even sleep at night. But she loved him, so she relented. After a few years, the Tchaikovsky family moved to the capital of Russia, St. Petersburg. This was his first experience with separation anxiety. Peter had grown attached to his governess and cried when he had to leave her behind. He was barely recovered from this trauma when he was sent off to a boarding school where he could continue his music lessons. He missed his mother so desperately, and he worked so hard that he became ill. When he recovered, he continued to work, making rapid progress. By the time he was 10 years old, he was already writing his own compositions. It never occurred to his family that he might make a profession of this talent, so instead they sent him to a law school in St. Petersburg. 4 years later, when Peter was only 14, his mother died of cholera. He was distressed not only by her loss, but by his father's seeming indifference to it. He descended into a grief and loneliness that he never recovered from. He also plunged himself into composing with even more fervor. He tried his hand at a waltz and made a few attempts at an opera. He stayed at the law school until he was 19, when he took a position as clerk in the Ministry of Justice. His work kept him too busy to pursue his music, but music was never far from his mind, and he made frequent trips to the opera. It was in this period that he chewed up the document he was supposed to deliver to an important official. During summers, Tchaikovsky traveled to London, Paris, Germany, and Belgium as a companion and interpreter to a friend of his father's. In Paris, he may have heard Chopin, who was then a famous young pianist. After his travels, he returned to St. Petersburg, where he began to study harmony with a teacher who bore the exotic name Zaremba. While he studied with Zaremba, Tchaikovsky kept his post at the Ministry of Justice and continued to pursue his law career. He applied for a higher position, but the world can be ever grateful that he was rejected. When he lost the post, Tchaikovsky finally decided to dedicate his life to music. At the age of 23, Tchaikovsky resigned from the Ministry of Justice and entered the St. Petersburg Conservatory. He also continued to study musical theory with Zaremba, and he began classes in orchestration with Anton Rubinstein. To pay for all these studies, he began giving music lessons. For the summer, Tchaikovsky took a break and stayed with his sister and her family in the countryside near Kamenka in the Ukraine. He would do this almost every summer of his adult life. When he returned to St. Petersburg, he was offered a position teaching harmony at the brand-new Moscow Conservatory, a position that kept him very busy, but not too busy to write. It was in this period that he started work on his first symphony and an opera. Composing was always a feverish and exhausting business for Tchaikovsky. It seemed to drain him both physically and emotionally, and he periodically had breakdowns after finishing a piece. At the Moscow Conservatory, he worked beyond his own strength and had to retire a while to recover. He once said of his composing, "I forget everything and behave like one demented. Everything inside me begins to pulse and quiver." Like Beethoven and many others, he seemed to become the music he was writing. When Tchaikovsky was 28 and had finished several compositions, he took his work back to St. Petersburg and showed it to the famous Five. The Five were a group of successful Russian composers that included Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, Modest Mussorgsky, Alexander Borodin, Cui, and the founder of the group, Mily Balakirev. Balakirev took a particular interest in Tchaikovsky and helped him develop his art and his career. It was Balakirev who suggested Tchaikovsky write Romeo and Juliet, which he completed in 1869 when he was 29 years old. Pretty soon he became the unofficial sixth member of the group. Tchaikovsky's struggle for success was not an easy one. There were many setbacks and frustrations that left him discouraged and depressed. Every time he was disappointed, he retreated more and more into a private, secluded life. He never stopped composing, but he gradually became more unhappy and more isolated. Part of this had to do with his sexual persuasion. At some point in his young adulthood, Tchaikovsky became aware of an inclination toward homosexuality. The world has seldom been kind to homosexuals, and in 19th century Russia, homosexuality was considered an absolute disgrace. Early on, Tchaikovsky became aware that he was a social outcast. He kept his inclinations as secret as he could, but he was always haunted by the realization that he was different, that he was unacceptable, and that scandal could ruin him. His entire life was one of private despair and loneliness. One night he burned all the volumes of his diaries when he realized that with his death they might be made public. In his late 20s, Tchaikovsky had a brief but unsuccessful love affair with the prima donna of a visiting Italian company named Désirée Artaud. It was one of only 2 romantic relationships with women that he tried, neither of which worked. Although he loved children deeply, he was forced to accept the fact that he would never have any of his own. Even though he became more and more reclusive, Tchaikovsky always liked to travel, and made several trips to Europe and later to America. He visited Italy, Switzerland, and Germany, and when he was 36, he went to Beirut and met Liszt, who was then an old man. Many composers of the time, including Debussy, made the pilgrimage to Bayreuth, where Wagner had built his famous opera house, and many tried to meet Liszt, who had been Wagner's close friend. But Tchaikovsky's favorite composer was always Mozart, whose genius he believed could never be surpassed. When he was only 7, it was Mozart's Don Giovanni, which he heard on a music box, that made Tchaikovsky beg for professional piano lessons. When he was 37, Tchaikovsky married a woman named Antonina Miliokova, but it was a marriage destined to fail. He married her mostly because she threatened to kill herself if he didn't. Antonina was an unstable woman who had a habit of biting her fingernails so deeply that her letters to Tchaikovsky were spotted with blood. She was also addicted to sex, a trait Tchaikovsky found repulsive. The marriage, which was never consummated, collapsed after only 9 weeks. In deep despair, Tchaikovsky tried to kill himself by jumping into the frigid waters of a river, but he was rescued and survived. He fled to Moscow in despair and got the obsessive Antonina to agree to a separation, although they were never formally divorced. In the following years, only his composing and occasional bouts of heavy drinking would relieve his emotional pain. The happiest times Tchaikovsky spent were in summers at his sister's country house in the Ukraine. But even these retreats were spoiled later when he became enamored with his sister's son, his own nephew. Although he never acted on his feelings, his guilt made it impossible to enjoy himself. Around this time, Tchaikovsky began an unusual and mysterious relationship with a wealthy noblewoman named Nadezhda von Meck. Von Meck, who was several years older than Tchaikovsky, was a music patron who had taken a liking to his compositions. She offered to pay him a yearly salary so he could give up teaching and devote himself full-time to his composing. She had only one condition: they must never meet. All communication would have to be through letters. It's not clear why von Meck insisted on such distance, since she would later help other composers, including Debussy, without the same requirement. If she and Tchaikovsky ever ran into each other in the street, both would hurriedly walk away. This unusual relationship continued for 13 years, during which there were volumes and volumes of letters between the two, but not one single meeting. Tchaikovsky, who was never very honest or revealing in his letters to people, once commented that it had become a tiresome responsibility to answer the effusive letters of Madame von Meck. In spite of these strange conditions, Tchaikovsky was joyous about his offer from von Meck. All his life he'd hoped for a way to have the freedom to concentrate fully on his music. All his life he'd battled a deep shyness that made it difficult for him to aggressively seek help and patronage from others. And now, here suddenly was the answer to his prayers. It was the help of Madame von Meck that enabled Tchaikovsky to complete his finest work. Money was always important to Tchaikovsky because he had expensive tastes and spent it faster than he could make it. He always took taxicabs unless he was working out a song by walking. He liked fine foods, wines, cigarettes, and perfumes, and he always dressed fashionably, complete with white gloves and a cane. He was also one of the first celebrities to take up sunglasses to avoid being recognized. The money from Madame von Meck became even more convenient when Tchaikovsky's former wife of 9 weeks began to demand regular payments from him, and he finally had to buy her off. After his mother, there never seemed anyone in Tchaikovsky's life who loved him genuinely and unconditionally. Tchaikovsky had just finished Swan Lake and started work on his opera Eugene Onegin when he had another of his breakdowns and had to retreat to Italy and Switzerland to rest. When he recovered, he returned to Russia and wrote his 4th Symphony. It premiered in Moscow under the direction of Nicholas Rubinstein, the brother of his teacher Anton Rubinstein. On the cover of the score was the dedication, "To My Best Friend." Madame von Meck, who was in the audience that night, was the only one who knew the dedication was intended for her. Tchaikovsky lived quietly and away from crowds. He always rose at 8 o'clock to begin work and sustained himself with cups of strong tea accented with lemon or raspberry. When working, he frequently forgot to eat and sometimes worked through the night without sleeping. There was a couch next to his piano so he could take short rests if he needed them. Tchaikovsky was often ill, suffering mostly from headaches and digestive upsets. Because of his ailments, he often feared he was dying. For exercise, he took walks, and he also liked to pedal around town on a new invention called the bicycle. A few years later, when he was 40 years old, Tchaikovsky wrote the thunderous 1812 Overture, which also premiered in Moscow. He became interested in Russian church music around the same time and wrote a symphonic poem called Manfred. The Manfred Symphony was an overwhelming success and is still considered one of his best works. At 48, Tchaikovsky started his first international tour as a conductor. It was a momentous event. Tchaikovsky was shy in public and terrified of performing. He often became so nervous with stage fright that he made himself ill. He was so afraid of losing his composure while conducting that he developed the eccentric habit of holding onto his head with one hand while he directed with the other. Tchaikovsky's first tour started in Leipzig, where he met the composers Johann Brahms and Edvard Grieg. He described Brahms, a German, as a wonderfully kind Russian gentleman type. The Norwegian Grieg he found to be delightfully spontaneous. Besides Leipzig, he directed his own works in Hamburg, Berlin, Prague, Paris, and London. Everywhere he received enthusiastic applause and the admiration of the critics. The tour was the high point of Tchaikovsky's life. From then on, he would sink deeper and deeper into disappointment and despair. In the same year he was touring, Tchaikovsky presented his Fifth Symphony and the popular ballet Sleeping Beauty. But it was also this year that Madame von Meck, for reasons unknown, suddenly broke off their correspondence. Tchaikovsky was in despair over the loss of this friendship and grieved over it until he died. On his deathbed, he repeated her name over and over in puzzled indignation. From this time on, Tchaikovsky's compositions became more emotional and intense. During the last years of his life, Tchaikovsky lived in a country home surrounded with flower beds outside of Moscow. He was supported by a yearly pension granted him by Tsar Alexander III, father of the last Tsar Nicholas, who was executed in the Russian Revolution. There was also money coming in from his compositions that enabled him to live, at least in material comfort, if not emotional. The year after von Meck deserted him, when he was 51, Tchaikovsky journeyed to America to take part in the grand opening of Carnegie Hall in New York City. He found America stimulating and energized, and he loved all its new inventions, like electricity. But he was terrified of conducting at Carnegie Hall, and he became even more nervous when he saw workmen were still putting the finishing touches on the building. He eventually gave a superb performance, but Tchaikovsky spent much of his time in New York in his hotel room crying. While in America, he also gave performances in Philadelphia and Baltimore. The year after Carnegie Hall, Tchaikovsky premiered the work that was to become his best-loved and most admired, the ballet, The Nutcracker. The concert version of this work, which includes 6 selections from the ballet, is known as the Nutcracker Suite, and is still among the most popular at concerts throughout the world. The ballet is a Christmas favorite for children's dance companies, and it was also the start of many brilliant adult careers. Margot Fonteyn, among others, first danced her way to fame in the Nutcracker. Tchaikovsky was by now a world-renowned composer. When he was 53, he visited London, where he was given an honorary doctorate from Cambridge University. At the end of the same year, he returned to St. Petersburg for his last performance and the premiere of his final composition. It was the Sixth Symphony, more commonly known as the Pathétique or Pathetic Symphony. As the name suggests, it was full of pathos and emotion. Because its finale was slow and subdued, the performance didn't end with the same lively applause most of his performances received, and Tchaikovsky became depressed. A month after his final symphony, Tchaikovsky became ill in St. Petersburg and died on November 6, 1893. He was 53 years old. There are two stories about the death of Tchaikovsky, and it's doubtful we'll ever know which one is true. The first version of his death was that he carelessly had a drink of unboiled water during a cholera epidemic in the city. He contracted the disease immediately and died within a few days. The other story, more widely accepted by scholars, is that the melancholy composer killed himself. He was being blackmailed by the family of a young nobleman with whom he'd been enamored. The family allegedly told Tchaikovsky to kill himself or they would reveal his sexual inclinations to the world. Seeing no way out, Tchaikovsky drank poison. At the time, most people believed he'd committed suicide, but they attributed the cause to his disappointment in the lukewarm reception the Pathétique had received. Suicide or not, Tchaikovsky died an unhappy man in spite of his recognition and success, and never resolved the deep longings and loneliness that filled both his life and his music. The music of Tchaikovsky spans a period of about 30 years, but the very best of it was written when he was in his 30s and 40s. He wrote 6 numbered symphonies, all of which were artistic landmarks. His first 3, written between the ages of 26 and 35, are performed less often than his last 3, which were written between the ages of 38 and 48. Symphony No. 4 was his first real success in this form, and Symphonies 5 and 6 were equally outstanding. His other orchestral work that's widely admired includes the Overture to Romeo and Juliet. He also wrote 9 operas, the most admired of which are Eugene Onegin and the Queen of Spades. His other operas are seldom played in the West. Above all, Tchaikovsky was the master composer of classical ballet. He created a new style in this genre called the symphonic ballet. In his ballets, he introduced traditional dance and folklore from various countries, all within a broader orchestrated framework. Swan Lake, The Sleeping Beauty, and the Nutcracker are among the most popular ballets in the world. Swan Lake, the first of these ballets, was completed when Tchaikovsky was in his late 30s. It tells the story of a prince who gets lost while hunting and discovers an enchanted lake inhabited by young women who have been changed into swans by an evil sorcerer. The prince falls in love with one of the women, but it's a love with a tragic ending. The prince eventually leaps into the lake to join his lover in death. Although much of Tchaikovsky's music reflected his own haunting sadness, he also wrote music that was lively and triumphant, like the famous 1812 Overture. The Overture was a celebration of Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. Tchaikovsky wanted this dramatic, thundering piece of music to be played outdoors with church bells, cannons, and fireworks accompanying it. But it wasn't performed that way until almost 100 years after his death, in 1990. Still, the piece is no less dramatic when it stands on its own. In 1892, when he was 52 years old and had just returned from his tour of America, Tchaikovsky unveiled his famous ballet, The Nutcracker. The 6 selections from the ballet, called the Nutcracker Suite, are believed to have gotten more people interested in classical music than any other piece of music. The story of the Nutcracker is about a little girl who dreams on Christmas night that her toy Nutcracker comes to life and leads toy soldiers in a battle against the Mouse King. The Nutcracker then transforms into a handsome prince who carries the little girl off to the Sugar Plum Kingdom, where toys and candies come to life to help them celebrate. In the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, Tchaikovsky was the first composer to write music for the celesta, a small keyboard instrument with light bell-like tones. After the enchanting Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy came a Russian dance, an Arab dance, a Chinese dance, the Dance of the Flutes, and finally the beautiful and popular Waltz of the Flowers. Tchaikovsky's final composition was the Pathétique Symphony, written the year of his death in 1893. It's a work that reflects all the pain and longings of his inner life, so much so that some people find it too full of grief to enjoy, but all agree to the beauty of its melody. Tchaikovsky considered the Pathétique to be his best work. Less than a month after it premiered, he was dead. For over a century, Tchaikovsky has remained the world's master of melody. He's known for his imagination, his flair for orchestration, and most of all, for his deep emotion. His music is elegant and sparkling on the surface, but underneath it is always a current of melancholy and longing. Although he burned all his diaries, Tchaikovsky's music remained as a continuous record of his own intense feelings of despair, culminating in his last beautiful expression of unhappiness, the Pathétique. The emotion of Tchaikovsky's music came from his own real internal pain, yet it's also this emotion that made his music so attractive to a broad audience. The great contribution of Tchaikovsky is that he bridged the gulf between the musician and the general public, and made classical music accessible and understandable to a wide audience. He did that not just with sadness, but also with music that is fanciful, delightful, and sometimes powerful. His own deep feelings created a life that was difficult and eventually even unlivable, but they also provided him with the means to create and leave for the world a great gift of lasting value: his symphonies, his overtures, his operas, and most of all, his ever-popular ballets.